Congrés. I anem preguntant-nos pels seus límits. Què passa? Ara a mi m'agradaria saber, aquest rum-rum, quin és el tema? Algú m'ho explica? No, com sou, Tenim un micro, per fer-vos participar. A mi m'agrada que la platea participi, perquè així és bidireccional. Us ha interessat aquesta taula, no? El que ve ara també us interessarà, i és un noi joveníssim. Jo és que ja veig tothom com de l'edat de les meves filles, sabeu què vull dir, no? Però el proper ponent és molt jove. Us deia, continuem abduïts i abduïdes per la intel·ligència artificial i preguntant-nos pels seus límits en un terreny on la majoria dels i les que som aquí, jo diria que se'ns escapa de les mans. No m'escolteu? Ara començaré a dir barbaritats, a veure qui m'escolta. Va, diu, i algú, va! Com sou, Això que avui esmorzant, que jo estava mig adormida, algú m'ha tocat l'espatlla, que potser està aquí, m'ha dit, som avorrits, els arxivers. I és que jo no sé dir mentides, dic, home, sou intensos. Però la veritat és que és un món apassionant, no? I jo que hi entro a dintre així com una autèntica extraterrestre, m'apassiona. Però necessiteu classes de comunicació. Hi esteu d'acord o no? Perquè aquí hi ha molta sabidoria, però jo que sóc experta en ensenyar a comunicar, veig uns PowerPoints, mare meva. Va, això ho dic amb ànim... No, és o no? No, perquè jo accepto les crítiques, que també n'he fet alguna, però clar, mireu, quan un o una puja dalt d'un escenari, el més important no és enxuvar molta informació, és el que fem els periodistes, que és la nostra feina, que és seleccionar què és el més important i explicar-ho de manera entenedora. Una paraula en una pantalla que reforci el que dius diu més coses que 1000 paraules en una pantalla, que no veus res. A banda d'això, continuo. Però això us ha servit, no? I us ho dic amb molt de carinyo, que avui vindrà el sopar, em sembla. Va, som-hi. Sí, una altra cosa que he fet és revisar ràpid les xarxes socials i el hashtag dades en acció, i les fotos són molt avorrides. Feu-vos fotos divertides, que demà us volem posar a la pantalla. Per tant, sisplau, aquest vespre feu fotos. I ara sí, després d'aquest parèntesi, reprenc. Ara silenci ja, que ja ens hem esvergit, ja us he explicat, jo m'he sincerat com a periodista amb vosaltres, com a professional de la informació. I ara continuo amb el tema que us deia de la intel·ligència artificial. Dèiem que en moltes d'aquestes coses sempre tenim por a les coses que no coneixem, no? Què passa? A la intel·ligència artificial se'ls escapa de les mans fins i tot els que estan treballant amb això, no? Per això és un terreny, la incertesa, desconegut, que ens fa por. Però és una tranquil·litat saber que hi ha organismes que vigilen el desenvolupament de la intel·ligència artificial i que estan sempre a punt per donar la veu d'alarma si passa alguna cosa. Això, com a mínim, hi ha algú que ens avisarà abans de l'hecatombe final. A veure, en el món de l'arxivística, aquest amic sentinella, n'hem sentit parlar també aquests dies, es diu Interpares Trust AI. 2021-2026 és aquest projecte interdisciplinari i multinacional que té com a objectiu això, dissenyar, desenvolupar i aprofitar la intel·ligència artificial per donar suport a la disponibilitat i accessibilitat de forma continuada a la informació pública. Té una clara vocació també de recerca i per l'ensenyament de les noves promocions d'arxivers, que aquí també se n'ha parlat, de la gent que ve, que ja venen amb una altra, són d'una altra generació i venen amb una altra mentalitat. Bé, a la ponència que ara ens oferirà en Peter Sullivan, que és molt jove, ens presentarà els objectius, Jo, els companys que esteu traslladant, segur que ho heu captat, Això ho he fet perquè... Ens presentaran els objectius i els primers resultats d'aquest projecte al voltant de la identificació de tecnologies basades en intel·ligència artificial que puguin abordar desafiaments crítics de documents i arxius, determinar els beneficis i riscos de l'ús de la intel·ligència artificial i garantir els principis arxivístics que formin part del desenvolupament d'una intel·ligència artificial responsable. Qui és Peter Sullivan? Doncs Peter Sullivan és estudiant de doctorat sota la supervisió del professor Mohamed Abdul Majid a la High School de la Universitat de la Colúmbia Britànica i els seus interessos de recerca inclouen tecnologies del processament de la parla, com per exemple la identificació del llenguatge i el reconeixement automàtic de la parla i en particular com aquestes tecnologies es poden aplicar per millorar la descoberta de material audiovisual i d'arxiu. Ha treballat amb l'equip Interpares Trust AI des de la proposta de la subvenció inicial i actualment treballa en un estudi destinat a millorar les metadades descriptives dels arxius radiofònics de la UNESCO. Rebem amb un fort aplaudiment a Peter Sullivan.
Thank you very much, Clara. I hope my PowerPoint slides are up to snuff. I'd also like to thank the Catalonian Archival Association for the invitation to be here and for this great event. I'd also like to thank the translators who are doing a wonderful job making this event multilingual. Thank you very much. And then finally, I'd like to thank my co-collaborators in Interpares. So without further ado, I'm going to be introducing the project as well as sort of really explain why we as archivists or people working adjacent to the archival field should care about AI as it's being deployed around the world. And how Interpares can help sort of guide research and development of answers to these challenges. So starting off, why should we actually care about AI? So I'm going to preface this by saying there have been a lot of tiptoeing around the ChatGPT discussion. Claire mentioned it at the start of the last introduction. A couple other people introduced it in their talks. And I'm not going to necessarily tiptoe around it, but I'm going to maybe not take a bite, but maybe a little bit of a nibble to see how generative AI might affect the archival field. And this is based on ongoing conversations that I've been having with archivists, including at the Faber-Lowell Archive residency last week. So to start off with an anecdote, I have a friend that works for an unnamed university IT department in the United States, and he relayed an interesting story. There was a dean at one of the schools that had been using ChatGPT to create emails sending out for business for the institution. Some of the other deans found this out and were furious. They called an all-hands-on meeting for the IT department and got everyone together to see what should be done about this new technology. And the IT department sort of shrugged their hands and said, well, we have no policy on it. We wouldn't really know it's being used. So, I mean, what do you want us to do? And this got me thinking, well, how would archivists deal with a similar situation? How would we think about using generative AI as it relates to archives? So one idea is that these generative AI tools may not be dissimilar from like fancy letter templates that someone might send out from an organization. So an executive is busy, they use ChatGPT to create some rough letter. They go over it, sign their name on it, and send it out. And as far as an archivist is concerned, well, they're communicating official business of the organization. There's an action that's recorded in that email, and so it should be just treated as anything else, just a fancy letter template. Marta Reis brought up an interesting idea that it's not just like capturing the function of the records. There might also be some interesting implications from copyright. So for instance, if someone is generating artifacts by an organization, AI and copyright law are a little nebulous right now, to say the least. A court case came out not too long ago basically saying that in the United States at least, you might qualify for copyright if there's a heavy human element, but otherwise maybe no. And so as an organization, you'd want to know if you're generating records that might not be copyrightable. On another level, you might really care about what's being submitted to your organization. Say, for instance, you're working in the department of a university that checks the credentials of applicants for a graduate program. Well, what if people can now sort of generate fake diplomas and submit those in their stead? So Pilar Campos raised this as a major thing that we might need to concern ourselves with. We can no longer necessarily trust on face value that something submitted is authentic. And Hrvoje Stančić, a professor at the University of Zagreb, pointed out that they'd actually deployed a blockchain-enabled diploma authentication system in order to combat just this sort of thing. But I wonder how widespread that might be. Are all sort of materials able to be authenticated in a purely automatic way? Who knows? These are ongoing conversations that we're having just about one type of technology. And the reality is it's part of a much broader conversation impacting many different types of technologies, all driven by AI. So for instance, thinking about how record keeping itself might be automated, how it might be used for appraisal assistance, PI identification, all sorts of things. And so it's important for us to think about AI as AI is posed to impact the authenticity of records, record-keeping processes, archival functions, and access to archival materials. So moving on, I want to illustrate how the iTrust AI project fits into this ecosystem of archivists as well as AI experts looking and examining how AI is being used in the archival realm. So first of all, Interpares is a long-standing project worldwide. It's been going on since the 90s. And this is currently in its fifth phase. We're headquartered in the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. And our current focus of this phase of Interpares is in artificial intelligence systems applied specifically to archival functions. So we're not looking at business use cases of AI. We're simply looking at how this might impact the archival field itself. Our directors are Luciana Durante and Mohamed Abdul-Majid, who are also professors at UBC. And our funding comes from essentially the Canadian government through the Social Studies and Humanities Research Council. Like the earlier phases of Interpares, we are having a consistent focus of maintaining the trustworthiness of digital records over time and the trustworthy access to and preservation of digital records in all media and form. We have a very large project, currently 85 different organizations, 120 different researchers in academic institutions, 90 collaborators in industry, and at the moment over 30 graduate research assistants, of which I am one. And so you can capture like the Interpares idea as trying to think about how can we use or develop AI systems to conduct research management and archival processes that will maintain the nature and trustworthiness of records. So let's think about what exact problems face AI application of archival application of AI. And I want to start from just a very, very basic introduction to the thing that basically powers AI right now, which is called machine learning. And so this is very basic. All the experts on AI in the field just note that this is giving context to some of the problems you might run into in employing an AI machine learning experiment in an archival institution. So machine learning, breaking it down really simple, you look at one random subsample of a set and train a model that you're then applying to the rest of that set, to your collection, perhaps. And so this could be like training a handwritten text recognition system. So you'll train it on some random subsample of your documents and then apply it to the rest. And machine learning in this supervised machine learning context relies on a couple assumptions. One is that there's a independence between the things that you're sampling, and that the things you're sampling are also coming from the same distribution. Whatever mechanism made these items in your set made the other items in the set. There's another assumption being made that this is not a time-dependent set. So later on down the road, you can make no claims that this model might function on, say, newly corrected data, although often we see this is the case that they're applied like this. So what are some issues with this idealized model? Well, again, what about new models? If you're collecting new records, how are you ensuring that your model is still applying to these new records? What about off-the-shelf tools? If you have a small collection that's very unique, is it similar in sort of the domain that the off-the-shelf tools you might consider applying were trained on? So we'd call this like a domain difference between the two settings. What about situations where you have lots of different types in your collection? Or if maybe there was like one originator for most of the collection, and so you wouldn't have independence between the samples in it. Finally, what if your boss came to you and said, I'd like a representative sample of this series. Can you explain how you sampled different items, different records in this series to say that it is a representative sample? So I'm going to make this a little bit more concrete by talking about it as a handwritten text experiment. Say maybe you're using Transcribus or something similar to that, where you're training a handwritten text recognition model, and you're planning on applying that to a bunch of other untranscribed handwritten documents. So is model B, maybe this is a off-the-shelf model that is available on Transcribus' website, better than model B, which maybe is one you trained yourself. And you're going to look at which one has the better word error rate, which one is better at avoiding misspellings or any sort of mistakes when it actually transcribes it. So the way you do this, you'd hand transcribe a small amount of documents. Transcribus says about 100. You divide into 3 sets, and then you'd do a model selection point where you'd use the validation set to determine the best settings for your model. Based on those best settings, that best configuration, you'd then run a final test where you'd see which of the models actually performed well on your held-out test set. So to recap, your standard split is like a train set, which is about 80% of the documents you'd have hand annotated, a validation set, which you use for model selection, and also helps prevent overfitting during the actual training process, and then a test set, which is again another 10%, which is just to make sure that model selection and the final evaluation are independent assessments. Recapping this, you'd annotate, you'd split, you'd do this model selection piece, and then you'd have your final test, and you'd be able to say, it was the our self-trained model after all, or not. But there's some issues in practicality with running this in an archival environment. This model selection piece is quite intense, and there's lots of different ways you can do this. One would be like a random search where you are randomly guessing what the potential parameters for your model are, and then you run a bunch of these and you see which one performs the best. This might take up to maybe 60 to 100 different runs of the model to see how well it does. You might do a grid search which says, based on certain settings of your hyperparameters, which are like the sort of configurations of the model, which of those work best, and you'd basically go through every possible combination of it, which often is not a good use of your effort or computational resources. But if you were to just say, I want to train and a test set, you might have this situation where you get lucky in the model you trained doing well on the test set, but doesn't actually generalize to the rest of the data set. And this will happen if you're training a bunch of models and running all of those on your test set. You might just eventually get lucky in this process. So you can't quite skip this model selection piece. And rather, the key point here I want to make is that you can only test once in this sort of setting. So you are left with a couple different approaches you could take. One might be what we'd call a zero-shot setting. You take an off-the-shelf model, you use your one of the sets you've annotated, either the test or validation set, and you just apply that and see how well it runs. And this answers our question of, well, even if you're using some off-the-shelf tool, you still need to know how well it's going to generalize on your data. So you still need to have a small annotated test set to determine that. And this might be good for technology that's fairly well developed, that has a good accuracy, and you don't really care too much about. So like OCR for like some fuzzy search type thing, where it doesn't really matter what the spelling is, they'll be able to get access to more information just by having it online. Another way to approach this would be to train, but don't do this sort of tuning step. So you're of the view that maybe your specific set of handwritten documents is too different from the available models online. And so you're going to train one model, and you'll use some known good configuration for the model. So you're not going to worry about being like a scientist and figuring out, oh, okay, this learning rate or this like this number of layers in the model is like the best way to design it. So you'll use someone else's configuration and then just train that on your model, and then you'll use a validation set to make sure you don't overfit, and then you'll test it to see how well it generalizes. And this last bit would just be do all of it. And you might want this if you need to ensure that you have to have the best performance, perhaps for liability reasons, you're dealing with sensitive information or what have you. And you can think about this in terms of graduated effort. In your zero-shot setting, you'd only really need to hand transcribe 10 pages, and you'd run one evaluation. You'd take that off-the-shelf tool, run it on those 10 pages, see how well it did. Training but not tuning would be quite a bit more effort in just hand transcribing stuff, but you'd have like custom models to your data. And then a full experiment might be quite intensive in terms of access to hardware, computational resources, and essentially the expertise to actually conduct the experiment. So each of these may have some fit for different institutional contexts, and it's important to think about these questions of why different contexts might benefit from other ones. So if we were to capture this this gradient of difficulty, applying AI tools in an archival environment might actually be quite difficult. Similarly, if you're just relying on off-the-shelf tools, they may not actually be tuned or well aligned for what your goal is. Similarly, off-the-shelf tools that are trained perhaps on internet corpora could introduce biases in it. All of the nasty things about human life that are on the internet might be encapsulated in that model and then propagated into how you're trying to use it. So what if AI solutions were informed by not just archival theory, but archival reality? And while there's certainly some models for this, for instance, Transcribus or the ePad program for looking through emails, or BitCurator for doing image visualization, what we see is there needs to be even more push to develop tools and approaches for the archival domain. So let's look at where Interpares fits into this. So Interpares' goal is to design, develop, and leverage artificial intelligence to support availability and accessibility of trustworthy public records by producing original research, training highly qualified personnel, and forming a sustainable partnership between academia, archival institutions, government records professionals, and industry. So this last piece is really important because the goal is creating this community that can benefit from one another and create a feedback loop where different skills are transmitted between the different types of institutions. So direct outcomes for this would be improving tools such as metadata enrichment tools, image recognition and description, optical character recognition, handwritten text recognition, tools for PII detection, and text summarization and classification. Indirect outcomes would include creating new professionals. There will be over 100 different graduate students who had been working on this project by the time they graduate, and they'll all have some significant competencies in understanding AI as it relates to archival functions. Similarly, the goal is to bring archival perspectives to other disciplines, as well as using collaborations between archivists and AI researchers to generate knowledge about how AI can be applied in archives. Finally, our goal is also to sensitize the AI community to the role of AI in record keeping and archival preservation, as well as the role of archival theory in AI design and development. So I'm going to finish with looking at a few case studies that have come out of the project, starting with my own. So I am working on a metadata enrichment study with Eng Sengsevang, who is an archivist at UNESCO. And so this radio archive is really interesting. It captures an interesting period in UNESCO history between the 1940s and the 1980s, when UNESCO ran a radio studio, and they would produce original content, capture meetings that UNESCO was conducting, as well as partner with other radio stations around the world to distribute that content or develop content in many different languages. So the issues with this archive is that it's been very poorly described. So the existing metadata is not sufficient to be searchable, findable, or really useful to anyone if it were put online. So what they've been doing is they've been having interns go through, listen to this audio, recording after recording, and pulling out really vital information for it to be searchable. For instance, creating descriptions of it, figuring out who is talking on it. A lot of UNESCO VIPs are present in this recordings, figuring out what it's about, what language it's on, and what time period it's from. And that whole process is extremely tedious and time-consuming. The current rate of using this laborious approach would take about 40 years to get through the full archive. And so our driving question is, how can AI enable better description of archival audio? The recordings are quite complex from sort of a machine learning sort of perspective, in that they're quite heterogeneous. They cover many different languages. They cover many different topics, which over the years has actually changed because UNESCO's mission has changed. So the different priorities that might have been around during the 50s and 60s might not be reflected in recordings that were made in the 1980s. And so that, that difference in time adds a really interesting complexity that machine learning researchers usually don't have to deal with. They're usually dealing with only one sort of epoch of time, one period of time. The number of languages is also extremely problematic, in that the intern will speak French and English, and likely not any of the 70 or so other languages that might be present. Furthermore, a lot of the recordings are multilingual. So that means that they don't actually know what language is spoken on the recording. It might be a mix of several different languages, which makes description very, very hard. There's also quite a few recordings to get through, so 16,000 total, which, as I said, would take about 40 years if you were to process all of it. And we're looking right now at applying 4 different AI tasks as sort of AI human-in-the-loop models. So generating predictions from the model that would be given to the intern to help inform how they do the description. So none of this would actually go directly to the metadata, but perhaps might be useful in speeding up this metadata description process. So the first would be spoken language identification. So just identifying what language is being spoken on this recording. And it's surprising, but this is actually kind of a non-trivial task. Some AI speech processing researchers might view it as one of the easier tasks, but it's very easy to create spoken language ID models that are imprecise, and it's because language itself is sort of a nebulous concept. Some languages might be closer together and might be easy to confuse, or for various reasons might be politically independent languages, but might be languages for politics more than necessarily like linguistic independence. The second task we're doing is automatic speech recognition. So we're generating transcripts from these recordings for the languages our model can process, as well as timestamps for when different things are said in the recording. And the goal with this is to allow the intern to quickly go through, figure out, say, when a name was said and verify that, oh, it is Mr. So-and-so or whoever. And that allows us a quick way to summarize things visually and then also verify by searching through the recording directly. For languages that are not in French or English, we're also looking at spoken language translation or machine translation as a way to take languages and translate them into English. And there are downsides to this in that it may be much harder to verify the authenticity of, or rather the accuracy of these translations compared to the transcription in languages that we understand. And finally, the last task we're looking at is text summarization. So from a transcript, could you generate a really short, 2 to 3 sentence summary of what the recording is about? And this is going to be a very challenging task for a machine learning model to do. There aren't good examples of text summarization being done on audio transcripts. So it's potentially something actually outside of the scope of what AI can do right now. And no, I'm not feeding it to ChatGPT. So lessons learned so far. One thing, as Clara mentioned, I'm interested in spoken language identification. And it turns out spoken language identification, as we've applied it to these models, isn't quite as accurate as we'd have hoped. Or actually, part of what we're trying to see is in this real world data, how well do these models that purport to be really accurate and to cover a bunch of languages, how well do they actually do? And some things we found is that it makes probably pretty awkward errors, for instance. So it has the model we're using has a real trouble differentiating Spanish for Galician. It makes that mistake a lot. Or it's confused a bunch of Serbian for Croatian. And so there might be situations where it's getting the language incorrect, and that may lead to the transcription being off or incorrect as well. So it's important for us for indexing or knowing what transcription models to use, that we really know this fundamental thing to start off. And if it doesn't work very well, then for some languages, these tools are just not fit for purpose. Another thing we've seen is that for what we'd call high resource languages, languages where there's a lot of data that's present online and that is easy to get to train models, that the off-the-shelf ASR that we've used has actually performed fairly well. So using Whisper as our transcription tool, for some of these, it's quite readable, quite easy to search through to find important information, and may in fact be a reasonably good baseline tool to compare. Finally, running on a GPU, so most machine learning models require a graphics processing unit, which is a piece of hardware in computers. It's actually fairly fast to run these AI models to process even a large quantity of audio. So we ran a batch of 6,000 audio files with this baseline model, it only took about 40 hours to run through that. So a big difference between 40 years versus 40 hours. But that being said, it's a first step which you then still need to go through, verify, and then use to write the actual metadata description. There are tons of more examples coming out of the Interpares project. So I just want to highlight a few just to give some shout outs. So Moises earlier was talking on the competencies panel. So we have a couple different studies that look at either AI literacy, curriculum development, or identifying what competencies are actually needed for professionals. And I want to emphasize how important that is for the professional community. There's a really cool project that's using computer graphics to try and uncover more information about medieval parchments based on the signum, the sign that notaries would use on the different parchments. So by identifying which signum a parchment belonged to, you can sort of get a sense of which notaries were responsible for what different parchments, and help establish sort of a notary logbook to give a sense of the history of these parchments. We have a study that's looking at using AI tools for direct record classification. So using AI to directly automate or improve things that archivists might do as part of their regular course of business is an interesting thing to identify as potential use for these tools, as well as identify potential flaws or issues that might come in employing them in these ways. Similarly, using these tools to identify personally identifiable information. Freedom of Information Act requests are extremely time-consuming, and if you were able to more easily identify sensitive information, it's possible that government accountability could be improved by faster and better access to documents in this way. Last of these sets of studies is sort of this study of how we capture the information inherent in an AI training process. So one thing that is not very standard or hasn't been documented much in industry is capturing the data, say information about how a model is trained, what data set it's been trained on, who did the training, all of these important pieces of information that are should be captured about the process of its development. So we call this paradata. And so looking at ways that paradata can be preserved and used as a way to document the development of AI tools in and of themselves. So this would be incredibly beneficial to be able to go back and scrutinize, say, model development to understand perhaps why it went wrong. Maybe it was the data set it was trained on. Maybe it was trained too long and overfit to a data set, so it's not as generalizable as the creators of it had hoped. And having access to that information through some sort of paradata scheme would greatly increase the transparency of these tools. And I want to end by just saying you too can join the Interpares project. So we are a community of researchers across the world, and it's a community focus. So research is by archivists alongside AI researchers, along by industry professionals. The word interpares is among peers. So it's not a group that is led by any particular research agenda. It's a group that's led sort of roundtable style by peers for peers. So I'm going to end it with this. So this is how we're bridging these two fields by building a community to help design tools and answer these challenges.
Vaig parlant i no se'm sent, Soc aquí. Un aplaudiment que ja l'heu fet per Peter Sullivan. Soc incapaç de resumir tot el que has explicat, tècnic, però sí que m'ha agradat començant dient, escolta'm, aquí tothom ha passat per sobre del xat GPT, ningú s'ha mullat, jo em mullaré una mica, i al principi del que ens explica l'anècdota del degà, no dic quina universitat, dels Estats Units, que enviava els mails amb el xat GPT i allò va ser un escàndol, però és que algú li va dir, escolta'm, és que això no està regulat, no hi ha lloc que digui que el degà no pot enviar aquests e-mails, que de vegades són repetitius i en cadena amb tot plegat. I deia, escolta'm, potser la comunitat que avui tinc aquí la podeu fer servir, perquè en el fons són plantilles que es van repetint, no? Per què no? Per què no ens ho plantegem, no? I llavors has tret el tema dels drets d'autor, que és un tema molt interessant. Jo quan no faig de periodista soc músic, llavors els drets d'autor són importants, no? I m'ha agradat una cosa, perquè diu, clar, com ho fem, no? Perquè també la intel·ligència artificial acabarà component música, ja ho està fent, i cantant, i totes aquestes coses, no? Al final dius, on seran els drets d'autor? I ell ho ha simplificat molt. Quan hi hagi una persona al darrere, la humanitat generem drets d'autor. La no humanitat no hi ha drets d'autor. Dic jo, s'acabaran els drets d'autor, no ens respectarà ningú. Jo no sé com ho veieu, però si aquí, que som el país més pirata del món, tenim l'oportunitat de no pagar drets, escolta'm, això serà... Jo ja hauré... Mira, ja rius, ja pots riure, jo ja em veig cantant al metro, m'enteneu què vull dir, no? Clar, és que jo... Aquí hi ha moltes coses. Interpares està a la 5a fase, la 5a dimensió, que és la dedicada precisament a com afecta la intel·ligència artificial al món dels arxius. Està molt bé que persones com en Peter i els seus companys i companyes es dediquin només a això. I ell deia, és un moment important, no només ens ho ha dit ell, jo crec que al llarg de gairebé totes les ponències ens han dit, aquest és un moment clau i és un moment d'oportunitats, perquè s'està creant una nova indústria. Està claríssim que és una nova indústria que ha d'estar interconnectada, i aquest és el moment de créixer tots plegats i de fer-ho bé, allò que dèiem, amb ètica, amb una bona normativa, tenim una quantitat de deures, per l'amor de Déu, impressionant. Parlant de deures, jo he al·lucinat bastant amb el tema aquest de la UNESCO, Pobres becaris, 40 anys de ràdio, sabeu quantes hores són? Mira, ja riu, 40 anys, dius, macos i maques, escolteu les cintes, 70 idiomes, detecteu l'idioma, quines persones són, no m'estranya que s'espavilin aquest jovent amb la intel·ligència artificial, escolta'm, això, ens passarem anys aquí i això no ho arreglarem. Per cert, Peter, jo he identificat un dels aparells antics que han sortit, perquè sóc una mica vintage, he identificat un Revox, el Revox, si ell fa així, volguem dir que sí, és que és molt jove. L'aparell aquell on hi havia la cinta... Quants anys tens?
Wow. No comment.
No comment, jo. No, però a mi... Jo vull dir una cosa, això que no s'interpreti en negatiu, perquè a mi m'empipa molt quan tenim una persona jove a l'escenari, sigui noia o noia, i fem, bueno, són jovent. Tot el respecte amb la gent jove, perquè se'l mereixen i se'l guanyen. És a dir, jo això ho dic de dir, escolta'm, xapó, el que ens expliquen, amb com es posen amb les coses sense por i com s'endinsen amb tots aquests mons. Però jo he identificat el Revox igual que el caset, que tampoc deu saber el què és. Les meves filles no ho saben, no? Doncs aquella cinta enorme Jo, just quan vaig acabar la carrera de periodisme l'any 95, fèiem servir els rèvocs, i me'n recordo a Ràdio Nacional, que era on jo feia les pràctiques, que n'hi havia un que la cinta les tallàvem físicament, i jo m'enganxava els dits amb els rèvocs. Ara quan l'he vist me n'he recordat dels meus dits i de la cinta. Tot es feia de manera manual, com han canviat les coses. Hem entès també que ens parlava de la intel·ligència artificial, per exemple, per saber la traçabilitat dels pergamins, perquè feia les lletres diferents i així ens permet identificar, arribar a cada notari i així sabem, i dius, mare meva, quantes coses a través d'això, aquesta eina feta servir cap a la part positiva ens pot ajudar moltíssim. I m'ha agradat molt aquesta convidada final de dir, escolta'm, Interpares és treballar entre iguals. Per tant, convida a tota la comunitat que avui estem aquí a participar en aquest gran projecte. Jo no sé si teniu preguntes per en Peter, obrim llum de sala, que ara ho veurem, però jo sí que tinc dues preguntes. Peter, una, tu has comentat que teniu, crec que sou uns 30 companys i companyes en aquest projecte Interpares com tu, que esteu... No?
Yep.
I jo et volia preguntar, quantes noies hi ha?
So, in terms of graduate students from the University of British Columbia, I think the majority of the graduate students in the program working for I Trust AI are women. So,
Ah, sí?
Yeah. So, we're situated in an I school, so an archival information science department. So the gender balance is maybe a little bit different from computer science, say. So it's more even, I would say.
Hi ha més igualtat, però amb el de la informàtica com esteu? No.
So on the...
Més o menys. Aquí només un 10% de dones en informàtica.
In IT, I don't know, because so in computer science and computational linguistics, which is where I'm situated, I think there are major issues with that gender imbalance. So I agree from that perspective, at least in North America, it's not where it should be.
Vale, hi ha algun problema? Deu dir que hi ha un gap de gènere important. Això passa no només, aquí passa a tot el món, vull dir, no és que digui, és per evidenciar que, amb tot el que hem dit avui, és important que les dones hi siguem, perquè si no passen coses, no? Vull dir, aquesta intel·ligència artificial el que farà és replicar aquests estereotips de gènere, si els que programen només són homes, blancs, el que dèiem, hi ha d'haver diversitat de totes maneres. A mi també m'agradaria preguntar a en Peter, com veus el futur de la intel·ligència artificial? Perquè aquí de vegades, el que dèiem, el desconeixement ens fa pensar que, ostres, el futur, i aquí el veu tot de color de rosa i aquí el veu tot negre. Tu que estàs treballant amb el tema, què creus que aportarà a la generació que ve, els propers anys, la intel·ligència artificial a la nostra societat?
I think it's going to be really interesting. So I see a lot of, Professor Abdul-Majid was talking about his kid really likes interacting with Siri, and I see a lot of kids who, or not Siri, one of the home assistants, the voice UI is what you'd call it. So a lot of these tools are really commonplace in everyone's household, and it's really interesting to see younger generations change their sort of information gathering behavior. Now maybe kids might not go search on Google to find stuff if they can just ask Google Home Assistant, tell me this thing. And that might have interesting things. They might be more inclined to search for information because that barrier is so low. They may just get into habits of asking about stuff and really develop interesting curiosity about that. I think it's going to be really interesting to see. AI certainly is going to develop in ways we can't predict, but I think the impact of AI on our information gathering skills, that's going to change even more. And it's going to change, and it is changing with the generations right now. So I'm fairly optimistic. It'll be different, and we'll have to think about how it's changing. Yeah.
No, si ets fantàstic, m'ha encantat, no?, de dir, ostres, aquesta facilitat de dir, ara ja no em dic, home, per què ets d'escriure si li puc demanar a la Siri que m'ho busqui, no? Vull dir, és una mica de dir, però si això, la reflexió, ens dona accés, no?, fa que la gent jove demani més informació, s'impliqui més, veiem la part positiva. Algú té alguna pregunta pel nostre darrer ponent d'aquest divendres? Perquè ara ja tenim una pregunta. Si ens pots dir el nom i endavant la pregunta per Peter Sullivan.
Bueno, Pilar Campos, soc de l'associació, ja si em coneixeu. Bueno, faré allò que ja tocava, que no és fer una pregunta, és fer un comentari.
Perfecte.
Sobre l'últim punt que ha dit en Peter d'animar la gent que s'aproximi al projecte Interpares, només recordar, l'associació som socis de suport. Si necessiteu ajuda, si us voleu implicar d'alguna manera a nivell personal i no institucional, pel que sigui, que veniu i parleu amb nosaltres, us posem en contacte amb el projecte o amb projectes propis de l'associació relacionats. És només aquest comentari. Gràcies.
Captant aquí, ho veieu o no, Us ho posem molt fàcil, ja directament, esclar que sí. Mira, aquí tenim una altra mà aixecada. Continua aixecant la mà, que no sé si t'ha vist, la meva companya, ara sí. Vinga, som-hi. És important que parleu quan tingueu el micro, perquè com que tot això ho gravem, si no... Vinga, endavant.
Sí, Aniol Maria, del grup de treball de transparència i dades obertes de l'Associació d'Arxivers. El tema del xat GPT, no sé si la solució seria un model o una eina que sigui de codi obert. No sé si això solucionaria massa el tema o teniu alguna idea des d'Interpares sobre quina serà l'evolució, cap on hem de tirar per aprofitar aquesta eina. Gràcies.
Endavant, Peter.
Yeah, so one issue just off the bat with ChatGPT is, again, it's a closed model owned by essentially Microsoft OpenAI. When you're using it, you're submitting your content to their servers. You could potentially be using it in ways where they can take that content and use it for their training that model. You may be essentially giving up sort of privacy and other like copyright considerations for the materials you submit to it. So I would say ChatGPT / that specific model definitely is not a thing that's going to benefit you. If you don't control the model, you have no way to verify how it's been trained or how it's been used. There are other open source, these are called large language models, and there are other open source large language models that may have capabilities that rival ChatGPT or GPT-3 or GPT-4. So those might be more appropriate solutions. You might be able to have those on a server you own and use them in ways in your own organization. So for instance, these large language models might be really good at doing things like summarization or what's called like in-context learning, where you sort of prefix how you're giving some stuff to it. It's able to figure out how to answer that sort of response. So there's actually potentially very creative ways they might be used, and I think that is one area we are interested in examining in terms of, do these have positive use cases in an archival setting? But ChatGPT itself, no.
Ha quedat clar, El ChatGPT no, és de Microsoft. Res és gratis, gratuït. Quan t'ho dones, jo és que quedo esperbarada de totes les dades que hi ha, allò que fem acceptar, ho dic en castellà perquè és allò que acceptar, tenen moltes dades nostres, perquè el telèfon t'escolta, encara que no tinguis la Siri, jo ho tinc comprovat, el telèfon t'escolta, el mòbil, sí, no només el meu, tots, jo tinc un iPhone, però vull dir, ens escolten tots. Per tant, és interessantíssim. O sigui, la resposta ha sigut no. Per tant, no ChatGPT, ja ho té claríssim, no ho faré pas, no. Codi obert, perquè clar, és que ens hi juguem molt, és que clar, llavors parlem d'aquestes dades, del que pot passar. Alguna pregunta, comentari més per en Peter, abans que ja passem a l'última xerrada final? No? Doncs escolta'm, moltes gràcies, Peter Sullivan, que ve des de Canadà, des de la University of British Columbia. Gràcies, congratulations, gràcies per acompanyar-nos.